So kind of refreshing from the last time we were talking about human population stuff. When we talk about human population growth, we are going to be looking at like the sex binary kind of thing, so that we can look at who has a uterus and can have a baby, who doesn't, and can't give birth to a baby, because that helps us to analyze like reproduction. So it really gives us this like window into like human fertility and reproduction rates. So when we talk about this stuff, we're going to kind of look at it from that lens. Because of that, a lot of the things that we're going to talk about as we go through, and a lot of the things we talked about last time that will affect population growth, focus on women. And that's because that's one way that we know that we can affect number of babies born. So we often will hear that like education of women will decrease population growth rates. Education of men changing population growth rates is a lot less clear cut. And that's because in most countries, most cultures, men automatically were the better educated group of people. And also because you don't have that direct connection to like the carrying the baby and giving birth to the baby that you have when we talk about like education of women, stuff like that. So we'll see that a lot of the stuff we talk about are going to like focus on the people who have uteruses and can give birth. So now to do the math, and we're going to kind of talk about this math and about population growth rates. So human populations are going to grow in the same way that populations of animals can grow or shrink. So our population growth is going to be like influenced by birth and death, and then immigration and emigration. So those same four things that change it in animals. And then what you would do is you would divide it by the total population size. So birth plus immigration, because that's putting animals, or humans in this case, into the population. So how many people are born in Atlanta versus how many people move into Atlanta. So those would be those two numbers. You would add them together to get one number of how many new people are in Atlanta. Then you would subtract the total number of people who died in Atlanta, as well as the total number of people who moved out of Atlanta. So you would kind of add deaths plus immigrants or immigration together, and subtract that from your births plus immigrants. Then you divide by your total population size. Now you can convert this to a percent or per 1,000. So you're going to have to like change that into a percent by multiplying by 100. Or you can do it per 1,000, and we call that the crude rate. Now we can also use this to find the crude rate of births or the crude rate of deaths alone. So crude birth rate would be per 1,000, crude death rate would be per 1,000 as well. Now, we have lots of factors that are going to impact growth. So we've already kind of mentioned a couple of those. Infant mortality would be one. Maternal mortality would be another. Education of women would be one. There's lots of different factors that are going to affect this population growth, especially in humans. We make a lot more choices consciously than animals do. So a lot of those kind of choices and ways that our societies are set up can affect population growth rates. So we'll talk more about kind of different ideas and how to discuss those next week when we finish up the notes. We're kind of just going to go over some of them now. Or we'll kind of go over some of them over the next couple of sections. Okay, so Earth has a carrying capacity. Now, Thomas Malthus created this theory. It's on pages 135 to 136. College Board wants you guys to make sure that you understand this Malthusian theory. So we're going to definitely talk about that. It can be a little complicated. If after notes today and after you go back and do a little studying tonight or tomorrow night or sometime over the weekend, you know, rereading your notes, you're still confused, read those pages in your book and email and ask questions. So in short, excess population growth will lead to resource depletion, pollution, overcrowding, and unemployment. And a lot of those things are related to poverty, so eventually a lot of these things are connected to poverty as well in humans. Those things can then lead to starvation, disease, crime, and possibly war. Now, this is kind of a doom and gloom kind of view of society and of people. But this is part of Thomas Malthus's theory, okay? Now, Thomas Malthus was doing this in the late 1700s, early 1800s. So this is an older theory, but some of these things still seem to be connected for pretty easy to understand reasons. If you have too much pollution and not enough resources, you're going to end up leading to disease caused by that pollution. Not having enough resources like food is going to lead to diseases of malnutrition, but it could also lead to starvation. So a lot of these things are really closely connected. Overcrowding can also lead to disease. That's the whole reason, right, for COVID, we have to stay 6 feet apart and have hybrid school and stuff, because overcrowding, we would get more transmission of disease. All right, so Thomas Malthus, late 1700s, early 1800s, argued that populations increase until they can't. That's what we often see in animals, that populations will increase until they get to that carrying capacity, and then they can crash a little bit, or they kind of stay at that carrying capacity. He suggested, though, that human population growth would outstrip the growth of efficiency of food availability, and that the human population would also see a crash. Now, thus far, this has not really happened in that way. Human population growth is kind of leveling off because as more countries become developed, people are choosing to have fewer children. Also, every time we have gotten close to the point where we were going to have mass starvation, there has been innovation in agriculture. Now, we are going to talk about the innovation in agriculture aspect in Unit 5. That's when we'll talk about what's called the Green Revolution. But just kind of a short summary so that you guys can kind of understand this Malthusian theory. During the early mid-1900s, we thought that there was going to be mass deaths in developing countries because they didn't have enough food. But a number of scientists discovered new ways to take advantage of land and new ways to modify crops in order to produce enough food. One of the people who is like well known for doing this is Norman Borlaug. We'll talk about him specifically. But it's a number of researchers who went to China, Mexico, and different parts of Africa, and different parts of like the Middle East as well after a time. I know Pakistan was an area where they went as well. So these were areas that were developing, having a lot more people, but they didn't quite have enough food. One of the things that they developed was a type of wheat that you could grow like twice each year in Mexico. So that means you can harvest twice as much because you don't have just one season for planting. So that's what we mean when we say like this food availability technology. So some sort of technique or technology that's going to let us grow more food. There are some other factors that are important too. So Thomas Malthus estimated that this population crash was going to happen a lot sooner than it has or it will, because it hasn't really happened yet. Because he was thinking that like space and availability of jobs was going to lead to like war and a lot of these kind of very negative consequences like disease and crime and a lot more human death. Now, humans will also be affected by density independent and dependent. So Thomas Malthus kind of understood this. He just thought that we were not going to be able to change the carrying capacity like we have, because that's really what humans have done. We have reached our carrying capacity and then used technology to increase the carrying capacity of the planet for us. So a density dependent factor would be COVID-19. Higher densities, like more people in one area, that equals more transmission. So that's why we're seeing like trying to keep fewer people around, you know, not having gatherings more than 50 people can slow that spread. Independent factors, density independent factors, would be those that do not depend on density. So everyone in the area would be affected regardless of how many people were in the area in total. So that would be like a tsunami, an earthquake, a natural disaster. All right, so now we're going to go over this rule of 70, and we're going to do the actual math part of the stuff we're talking about next week. We're going to have a whole day for math. But I want to go over this concept right now. So the rule of 70 is this really kind of easy way to determine the number of years that a population will take to double. So you estimate the doubling time of any population that is growing exponentially. And we use just the percentage. So basically what you do is you plug in the percentage of population growth and you figure out how many years it will take to double. So the number of years to double equals 70 divided by your annual growth rate. So for instance, if our annual growth rate was 2%, we would take 70 divided by 2. It would be 35 years until the population doubled. So this is a really easy equation. It's one of those that like mathematically is simple, but you will have to kind of remember this one, okay? So we have the rule of 10% from unit 2, and now we have the rule of 70 from unit 3. All right, now as we talk about humans, we're going to talk about this theory called demographic transition. Demographic transition is a feature of population growth or population-like growth patterns in countries as they change from a primarily like agricultural economy, primarily developing, to a developed country. So we're going to see what happens here. Now, more modern demographic transition graphs that you'll see will actually have a stage 5 where the population goes down a little bit, although there's a lot of debate as to whether that should be a stage 5 or just like an optional thing. So the question is, will all countries as they become developed decrease in population size like Japan, like Germany? Or will some countries stay at a slow growth rate or a like 0 growth rate like the US? All right, so stage 1. Stage 1, we have our birth rate in pink, our death rate in blue, and then our total population size in red. In stage 1, we are in a pre-transition, pre-industrial phase. We have lots of babies being born and lots of people dying. Typically, we have lower medical care, so not a lot of health care. Lots of dangerous jobs, so, you know, hunting, farming, but things that are more dangerous. Because of that, the population growth rate is going to be close to 0. So this would be a primarily agricultural societies. Ancient societies would have been here with high birth and high death rate. Any society where you have high risk or manual labor jobs as the primary job, and you have little to no medical care. Then we move into this early transition or transitional phase. The early stages of the transition, death rate will begin to fall. So transition happens in both stage 2 and stage 3. We can kind of consider both of those transitional. But the first thing that happens is the death rate falls, but birth rate stays the same. Basically, the death rate begins to fall because we have better medical care or better nutrition, or both. So you have better medical care, people start to live past childhood, you end up having this death rate start to fall, but your birth rate stays high. We can kind of see this happen in the US. You know, 200 years ago, there wasn't a lot of medicine. You know, doctors might bleed you instead of giving you any kind of actual treatment. And so death rates are high. If you actually look at like a cemetery, an older cemetery in the US, you can see that like for like a couple, they might have 5 or 6 kids that are buried with them that were buried in infancy. So during their first year of life. Diseases such as smallpox, whooping cough, those kinds of things were really dangerous. And so people would have many kids because many of them might not reach adulthood. Now, initially, as we started to have better medical care, better nutrition, those death rates start to fall. But people are still programmed to just have as many kids, and also they don't have as good access to like ways to prevent childbirth. So someone who had, you know, 3 or 4 siblings die when they were little would still end up having lots of kids. So you still have that high birth rate. The next thing that happens though is the birth rate will start to go down. As people survive infancy, families are now incentivized to not have just as many kids as they could have because they kind of trust that almost all of their children are going to survive to adulthood. So that's where we start to have the birth rate go down, and that's in stage 3. We can call stage 3 late transition or industrial. And the reason we add industrial there is because this happened in the developed world. So like Europe and the US, it happened right around the time of the Industrial Revolution. We started to see those birth rates fall as industrialization came. The gradual decrease of birth rates is a result of changes within the cultural norms of the country. So it doesn't necessarily have to happen with industrialization, but it kind of did in the first countries that we studied. My family is a great example of this kind of transition because my grandma was one of 12. She's the youngest of 12 kids. My mom was one of 8. I was one of 3. And now I've had 2 kids. So just looking at those generations, we can see that the birth rate has gone down. We have chosen to have fewer kids because, you know, when my grandma was one of 12, her and her siblings were working by the time they were, you know, 11 or 12. That's illegal now for good reason. So, you know, it's not, they're not incentivized. I'm not incentivized to have more kids because it's not going to be an economic benefit. Although they are super cute. At least my 2 kids are. I like them a lot, even if it sounds like they're a drain. All right, last one we're going to call post-industrial or post-transitional, and I'm going to just pop back up here. So what you can see is that total population size has kind of grown, but as we leave stage 3 and we enter stage 4, we're going to start to see it kind of level off because what will happen is the birth rate will get low and it will be about the death rate. So now that kids are no longer a benefit economically, they're more of a drain on economic resources. So families tend to pay more for kids as they go through schooling up until they are going to like go out on their own. So, you know, costs that you guys are probably very familiar with, new clothes, tutors, school tuition, all of those things. We now have this more incentive to have fewer kids, so birth rate is low. Also, most kids are going to survive to adulthood, although still, you know, drive safe because that's going to be the #1 problem with teenagers. But yeah, we're going to have fewer births, fewer deaths. And so our population growth will continue a little bit into this 4th stage as our birth rate continues to go down to match the death rate. But it will start to level off towards the end of stage 4. Now, this is where a stage 5 will sometimes come in, because often what happens is the birth rate goes a little bit below the death rate in several countries. So we've seen this happen in Japan and in Germany. Those are 2 really good examples. It has not happened in the US yet. Now it might happen in the future in the US, or it might just not become the cultural norm. But in countries like Japan and Korea, where children, you have to pay a lot of money in order for like school and activities, and it's very culturally expected that parents are going to pay for multiple after school programs and classes and all that thing, all those kinds of things, people are more incentivized to have fewer children. So there's a lot of only children in countries that have that kind of expectation. Same thing-ish in Germany. All right, so eventually after a country is industrialized, the birth rate may drop below the death rate, which can lead to that negative population growth. Usually the birth rate doesn't go so low that we have like very, very low growth. It's just going to be kind of lower. All right, so that is the end of Unit 3. So if you're looking on AP Classroom, I'm going to put together a like progress check for you guys to take next week after your like multiple choice one is done. That will be Unit 3 questions, but also a couple Unit 5 questions. The reason we're skipping ahead to part of Unit 5 is because this deals with urbanization. And when we talk about human population growth, we kind of have to talk about cities. Because when human population grows, we put people in cities. Like that's where most people end up. All right, so there are a number of different things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk today about saltwater intrusion, impacts on the water cycle. We're going to talk about fossil fuel burning a little bit. And then we're going to talk about drainage with impervious surfaces and urban sprawl. So kind of a lot more of these kind of new vocab terms, but a lot of them make sense. So they're somewhat easy to kind of remember. They're not going to be easily confused. All right, so first, an urban area, it's a city, or a town plus its suburbs, okay? Depending on what we're talking about, it could be bigger or smaller, right? Atlanta is going to be pretty big, but LA is bigger. It's a bigger area, okay? And then compare that to like Savannah, Georgia. Would still count as an urban area in the city of Savannah, but not the same as Atlanta, right? Atlanta's much bigger. All right, so our city is a large number of people with a variety of professions. They depend on resources from outside the city boundary. If you were trying to eat local and only eat things that were grown in Atlanta, you would be in trouble. It would be very difficult. The rural area is any area with a population less than 2,500 people. So this would be outside of the city of Atlanta, where you would have, you know, fruit farms, vegetable farms, grazing land, places like that. When I taught at the college up in the North Georgia Mountains, Young Harris College, I lived in a rural area. The county, the whole county had about 10,000 people, I think it is. And the city of Young Harris should not be called a city or a town because it only had like 1,500 people when students aren't on campus. When students were on campus, then it had maybe 2,000 people. So urban growth. Now let's talk first about village. So village, this is a term that we might see used to talk about a group of rural households. A lot of times these smaller areas like that Young Harris area I was telling you about are rural, but you do have a little bit of a like community there because everybody kind of knows everybody else. They're often linked by custom, culture, or family ties. It was very, very common for me to like have my parents come to visit and then they would stay at like the hotel in town, and like the night clerk at the hotel's cousin owns the restaurant. So it is very small, but most people kind of knew each other. And also there's usually in these communities a historical connection to the natural resources. Now in the mountains in North Georgia, the natural resources we're talking about in some areas are gold. Dahlonega has the gold rush thing, so there was some mining, but a lot of it is just the natural resource of good soil, of being able to grow food, so farming. Now, when we talk about urbanization and urban growth, what we mean is that we have had a lot of people moving from areas that are like Young Harris, those rural areas, into the city. So when we talk about this, like how urban is a state, for example, we would be looking at the percentage of people living in an area with more than 2,500 people versus the percent of people living in these small towns. Now, there are a couple things that produce urban growth. One is people living in the city are going to have babies. You know, one of my daughters was born in Atlanta. One of them was born in Nashville, Tennessee, because that's where I was living then. But, you know, people who live in cities also have babies. So we have birth. But the thing that we're going to focus on most is this immigration. Poor people tend to be pulled to urban areas or are pushed out from rural areas. And this pull and this push comes for a couple of reasons. We're going to kind of talk about some of those. Just in general, we have had an increase from 2% to 45% people living in urban areas since 1950. And by 2050, we expect it to be about 2/3 of the world's population living in urban areas. So it seems like cities are going to continue getting bigger and more of a percentage of the population. All right, so we're going to talk about this push from the country first. So we have this overpopulation in the countryside. In some areas, this can be a problem, especially areas where people might have like a second home for vacation. So say someone lives in Atlanta, but they really like to go to the lake or to the mountains for vacation, and they buy a home in a rural community. Then you might not have as much housing available for people who live there full time. Economics is a huge one. When I lived in Young Harris, I actually knew one family. Their kid was one of my students at the college. They were local. They lived in that county. And the dad would actually, he was a mechanic. He worked in Atlanta. He would drive 2 hours, work in Atlanta all week, and then come back home to Young Harris on the weekends. And that's because he was making better money as a mechanic in Atlanta than he could in the Young Harris area. There just weren't as many people needing cars fixed. Now, he also fixed cars in the Young Harris area on the weekend, like in his front yard. But that was definitely an economic. He was being pulled into Atlanta because of economics. There's also racial or religious conflicts often because towns and rural areas tend to be very homogenous. You can have people pushed out of the area because they are a different group than someone else. So someone who might be part of the LGBTQ+ community doesn't feel safe in a rural area in some parts of the country or some parts of the world. Maybe people who have a different religion. People who are different from that culture in any way can kind of get pushed out of that rural environment because they don't feel like they belong. So that's another one. Land ownership by the wealthy elite is a big problem in some areas because what happens is people who don't live there buy up this land, and then the people who used to live there or who live in the nearby area are having to rely on these wealthy outsiders for their income. This one happens a lot in mining, so we'll talk about it more when we talk about mining, but that's a good example where the people who own the mines don't live in West Virginia, but they own most of the land in West Virginia. And there was a lot of other things that those people kind of took advantage of miners in the early days of mining. Changes in agriculture are another one. It's really, really hard to have a family farm right now. And these large monoculture farms coming in often don't hire local labor. Instead, they're using more immigrant labor. So they're going to use people who are coming to the country but don't live there full time. And that changes in agriculture thing is also a problem for these small family farms because if people can hold on to their land and can farm, often the way that the government loans work, they're not able to get the same amount of loan as these large monocultures. And probably a lot of times those people don't want to work for a large monoculture. Their grandfather, their father, et cetera, has always farmed this land. They don't want to be working for someone else. So you might hear a little bit from both sides, immigrants are taking the jobs, which is in part, they are the ones who are being paid by these monoculture farms. But a lot of times the people who actually live there are not willing to take those jobs. They're still going to try to keep their farm working, but it's very, very hard. And a lot of times the kids will see that and they'll move away. So this is usually a generational thing where like the parents might kind of keep working the farm even though they're making very little money, but the kids will see that and will decide that they're going to go become a vet or a doctor or just move into the city and do retail or something like that. All right, now pull into the city. So first off, cities are exciting. There's a lot of stuff to do in a city. There's entertainment, there's food. I could tell you the restaurants in Young Harris, there were 2 barbecue places in the county, and there was one Asian restaurant called Bowl of Asia. That's right, all of Asia, one restaurant. In Atlanta, that's kind of how we know the restaurant is not going to be that good, right? Because they're not specializing in something. But yeah, there's very few options for entertainment, for restaurants. The movie theater there would have I think they had 3 screens, and the last movie would start at 9 p.m. So very different from what you might find in Atlanta. Also jobs. A lot of people come into Atlanta, like I told you about that guy who was a mechanic, for jobs. That's one reason that my family moved back here. My husband is a software developer. We couldn't really live there and him work in software because even if he could work from home all the time, the internet was so slow. So it just wasn't good for opportunities for him, as well as educational opportunities. Cities have really good educational opportunities. So a lot of times young families, like we wanted to move out of that area to give our kids better opportunities as well. Housing is also sometimes a problem, especially if it's an area where a lot of more wealthy people will vacation, buying up housing. And that really depends on what area we're talking about. In some areas, that's not as big of a problem as in others. I didn't really see that in North Georgia, but it might be more of a problem in places where there's wineries or vineyards out in California. I already kind of talked about entertainment, social mobility and power. If you are a person who wants to, you know, get a better job than your parents, who wants to go into politics, the chances that you get elected might be high in your small town, but the chances that you're going to be able to do something important might not be very good. And then specialization of professions. If you want to do something very specialized, the chances that that's going to be found in a rural community, unless the specialized thing you want to do is like design machinery for farms, is going to be limited. All right, so here is our urban share of the population. So worldwide, about 46.7%. And I thought that number was low when I said 2%. It should be 29%. All right, so 29% to 46%. And then 2050, it's 67%. And that's the world. In North America, we were already more people in cities to start with, but we're estimating that in North America, it'll be close to 89% of people will live in cities in 2050. All right, now, the number of large cities is mushrooming. Today, more than 400 cities have over 1 million people. There are 18 what we call megacities, so that is a city with over 10 million people. Tokyo, Mexico City, and New York are some good examples. And then there are 4 hypercities. Hypercities have more than 20 million people. So New York would not fit in there because New York is at 17. Tokyo would though. So in addition to Tokyo, well, actually Tokyo should fit in there now. I think these numbers were taken from 2 different time periods, my bad. But Mumbai, so India, Lagos in Nigeria, Dhaka in Bangladesh, and Sao Paulo, Brazil would be our other 4 giant cities. And like I said, Tokyo, I believe this number I got was more recent than the numbers I got for Mexico City and New York. So I think Tokyo would now be considered that hyper city as well. Many of these cities are already short on water. Many of these cities have waste and pollution problems. Mumbai has problems with waste and not being able to treat the wastewater quickly enough. Sao Paulo, despite the fact that Brazil we think of like beaches, has issues with clean water and having enough sources of clean water. So these huge urban kind of areas or agglomerations, these would be mergers of multiple cities are happening worldwide. So you're getting areas that you're losing the distinction between this one city and the next city over. The San Francisco Bay Area is kind of a good example because there's a ton of little towns and small cities there, like Sunnyvale, and I can't remember the names of other ones because my friend lives in Sunnyvale. Oh, San Jose is another one. They're all in this same area, but they're becoming this kind of agglomeration of a large urban area in the Bay Area. So urban growth is slower in developed countries. Poverty is becoming increasingly urbanized. So a lot of times poor people are in the cities trying to get opportunity. But we end up seeing slums, squatter settlements, and what we call shanty towns. So these communities with people who are living in kind of ramshackle, cobbled together buildings in order to have some place to sleep. At least 1 billion people live in crowded slums of inner cities worldwide. In those areas, a lot of them have no access to clean water, sewer, electricity, or education. 100 million people are homeless and sleep on the streets in these areas as well. A good example would be Mexico City, or a bad example, depending on how you look at it. It is the world's 2nd largest city. It includes 1 in 5 Mexicans live in Mexico City, so 20%. It has severe air pollution. And because it's in this valley, so Mexico City kind of sits in a valley, the air pollution kind of stays right there. It is estimated that it causes 100,000 premature deaths per year. They have a high unemployment rate. Sometimes, some years it's close to 50%. That leads to a high crime rate. If you don't have employment, if you can't earn a living some legal way, it can lead to crime. Over 1/3, about 6 million of the residents live in slums or barrios without running water, without sewer, or electricity. Now, a lot of times they do have some sewage, or sometimes the sewage will be like combined into one area, but it's going to depend on where we're talking. And because you have so many people crammed together, we have high disease infection rates. So these slum areas can be big, big problems for the people who live there as far as staying healthy because of not having access to clean water, but also the high disease rate. All right, we are going to talk about problems in the US next time. We're going to kind of stop here. The urbanization stuff, where a lot of it should kind of make sense to you, but it might not be things you've thought of before. So what I would do is over like the weekend, because I don't see you guys tomorrow, is kind of do a little bit of going over your notes, looking through those pages in the book, just to kind of orient yourself. Because I don't think I've told you guys anything that's too shocking or surprising, but it's not something that you will have maybe learned in many other classes. All right, any questions? I know it was a big notes day.